Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Wilson Center for one of our final programs of 2020. Today's discussion is co-sponsored by the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States and the Wilson Center's Asia program. And both programs are thrilled to have with us again, Professor David Shambaugh, well known, I think, to all of you. He is the Gaston Ségur Professor of Asian Studies, Political Science, and International Affairs, and director of the China Sea Policy Program in the Elliott School here at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He earned his PhD from the University of Michigan, on the old Michigan Mafia, where he studied with Michael Oxenberg, again, well known to many people, perhaps also an advisor for people who are on this call. And I can't run through everything that Professor Shambaugh has done throughout his storied career, but I should note that he was the editor of the China Quarterly, that he was a Wilson Fellow twice, I think, 2 different Wilson Fellowships, as well as the former director of the Asia program, which is a co-sponsor today, and also worked in the U.S. Department of State and the NSC. And then, perhaps most importantly, over the past several decades, he has trained generations of students and written some of the most influential books on China and U.S. China relations. Over 30 books and major articles, including China's Future, which we launched for Washington, D.C. here at the Wilson Center in 2016. He has conducted his research around the world in China, Singapore, London, Australia, Russia, and Europe, just to name a few locations, and most recently, and most importantly for today's program, in Southeast Asia. He is the author of the newly published book, Where Great Powers Meet. I guess that's left, right, reversed, but you can work that out. Where Great Powers Meet, America and China in Southeast Asia. The subject was timely when he was conducting his research and is, of course, more timely now. During COVID, Asean has become China's #1 trading partner. Not clear that it will retain that status after COVID, but for now, it has that status. And of course, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, which was an ASEAN-launched free trading agreement, has now been completed, including China and Japan and South Korea, but not the United States. So this is a topic that grows in importance. We're going to ask Professor Shambaugh to make some initial comments introducing his research. He will then have a discussion with our own Ambassador Stapleton Roy, who was ambassador not only to China, but to Singapore and Indonesia, and knows the area and these issues well. David, welcome back to the Wilson Center. As always, we are grateful for your scholarship and also for your friendship. It's nice to have you.
Robert, thank you. It's very kind of you to say. Indeed, I have a special place in my heart for the Wilson Center, both from when I was on the staff there back in the 1980s, the Neolithic era, and then as a fellow in the early 2000s. But I really have enjoyed all my time at the center and interactions with the center, and I want to thank you and the Asia program and the Kissinger Institute for hosting the launch event today. And to my dear friend and colleague, Ambassador Roy, thank you very much for your time and joining us for commentary. I know of no other diplomat who has served both in China as ambassador and in Southeast Asia, not just in 1, but 2 countries, in State's case, Singapore and Indonesia. So you are indeed an expert in this area too. So let me open, I'm not an expert. Let me open with some general comments, and that's sort of one. This is a new topic for me. But let me give some sort of framing comments first about the book, hopefully maybe enticing you to go out and order one after the event today. You know, Christmas is just around the corner. It makes a really great gift for your loved ones. No, in all seriousness. But let me try and give you some sort of context for why I undertook this study, and then follow that with a few of the major conclusions and takeaways, and then finish up peering into the future, as the book does in the final chapter. Offers a series of 4 sort of alternative futures scenarios, so I can kind of give you a synopsis of those. But let me start first by saying that this is was a wonderfully rich experience for me as a scholar, I have to say. I've written on Chinese foreign relations with different parts of the world, previously, many different parts of the world. But Southeast Asia is an area of the world and of the region that I had not spent much either physical or intellectual time in prior to this endeavor. And this took 4 years to bring this project from start to finish. And it was a tremendously rewarding experience. Perplexing on the one hand, because Southeast Asia was not only terra incognita to me, it is an extraordinarily diverse and rich region with diversity in every sphere, from economics to culture to ethnicities to political systems to geography. And so it was really, I had no idea when I got into the book just how complex the subject matter was. And of course, you have many actors here. You not only have the 10 Asean states as actors individually, and ASEAN as a kind of collective actor, and then the two major powers that I'm looking at, the United States and China. But as I'll note in a minute, there are other actors in this storyline too, the story being international relations in Southeast Asia. So the further into it I got and the deeper I dug, the more complex it became, and hence the more challenging analytically it became. But I have to say, the more rewarding it was by the time I got finished. It started for me a love affair with the region that will continue the rest of my life. Makes me wish that I had gone into Southeast Asian studies much earlier than I had. So the book was initiated by a sabbatical, like all good books. Wrote one of my previous books on sabbatical at the Wilson Center, the Communist Party book. I had a sabbatical back in 2017, and instead of go back to China as I had on the previous sabbatical, which produced China Goes Global, I decided to go to Singapore, where I had a very nice offer from the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang University there. And I can't say enough good things about RSIS as an institution and the people there. They were very hospitable to me, and it was really a great place, great institution to be. But Singapore is physically right in the center of the region, so you can literally get everywhere within about an hour's plane flight. And I did. I got all over the region, in part due to the fact I was also simultaneously on the Department of State's International Speakers Program. And I gave, I don't know, something like 40 lectures in 10 countries in 6 months, every Southeast Asian country except Laos, plus India. So I got around physically. And I went back the following year in 2018 for the summer, a good part of the summer, to the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, also in Singapore. And I finished up the field research in Malaysia and Indonesia that summer. So that's that's kind of the context of how this project came about. Second sort of preliminary thing to note is that this is not just a book about China and Southeast Asia, of which there are in fact several that have recently been published. There's sort of a little mini tsunami of publications and of books recently, including our colleague Mike Lampton's recent book about the high-speed rail endeavors there, Murray Hebert's new book, Sebastian Strangio's new book, Don Emerson has one. So I think mine is sort of the fifth in 8 weeks that has appeared after, several decades, really. The last book on China and Southeast Asia, I was telling somebody the other day, that I can remember, David Mozingo's book back in 1967 or something. So all of a sudden, people are paying attention to this. But my book is not just about China and Southeast Asia. It's about the United States and Southeast Asia as much as it is about China and Southeast Asia. And of course, it's about the interactions between these two major powers. Third sort of caveat is also to note, this is not just a study of contemporary affairs. If you're going to go out and buy this book, be forewarned, there's a lot of history in it. It's not a kind of 2020 or 2021 sort of study. It has 2 full chapters and half of 2 other chapters that deal with the pre-21st century events. In the case of the United States, this goes back to the first American consul, who was sent to the Dutch East Indies in 1802, and then the first treaties that the United States signed with the Kingdom of Siam in 1833, and then it proceeds through the America becoming a Pacific, imperial, and in the case of the Philippines, a colonial power following the Spanish-American War, then proceeds through the naval and commercial expansion of the United States in Southeast Asia in the early 20th century, through the Second World War in the Pacific and the Asian mainland, and the entire Cold War, not the least of which was the American War in Vietnam. So there's a lot about the United States that predates the current time. In the case of China, it goes even further back, like everything else. It goes back to the Qin dynasty, when the first recorded records of interactions between the Han and what were called the Yue people, south of the Yangtze River, and the Dai people in current day Yunnan. There were so many Yue people, they became known as the Bai Yue, the 100 Yues, but largely inhabited modern day Vietnam and southern Guangxi and southern China. So it starts there, and then it goes through a long history of the Nanhai, Nanyang trade and the tribute system. Then the protracted animosity between China and Vietnam, including China's subjugation and occupation of Vietnam for a century. The use of Southeast Asia as a revolutionary base by Sun Yat-sen and the nationalists before they successfully overthrew the Qing dynasty in 1911. Discusses China, Southeast Asia between the 2 world wars, and then goes into a rather lengthy discussion of the People's Republic of China's interactions with the region after the PRC was established. Both the non-aligned movement, Bandung thrust, you might say, and as well as the rather subversive, I think is the only word for it, thrust of supporting Communist Party movements, armed Communist Party insurgencies in every single Southeast Asian country during the 60s and the 70s. So there's a lot of contemporary analysis in this book, to be sure. But I just want those of you who are considering buying it to know you're going to get a good dose of history as well. And that to me was, as an author, I have to say, one of the most interesting parts of the project. And then the last sort of preliminary thing I'd like to say is that the book proceeds from the premise, and I believe this in general, that the United States and China are now locked into indefinite, comprehensive competition. And that is true across all functional domains, political systems, diplomacy, commerce, security, military, espionage, ideology, values, science and technology, education, research, public diplomacy and soft power, culture, media, governance practices, and global governance. Everywhere that I look in our world today, I see the US and China competing, having different positions in all of those spheres, except perhaps in the last one, global governance. The competition is also comprehensive in that it spans the entire planet, every region of the world. So Southeast Asia is an interesting kind of microcosm because it really encompasses most of these functional domains, but in one geographic region. So that's the operating premise, the kind of independent variable that I proceeded in the book from. And it's the new normal, I think, for international relations. Sino-American competition is the overriding singular characteristic defining international relations today and into the future, in my view. And Southeast Asia is very much a region in the kind of crosshairs of this competition. I call it the epicenter in the book. But it's going to be increasingly difficult for the Southeast Asian states to navigate this competition. And it's going to be very interesting to see how they do so. Now, Southeast Asia has a long history of external powers intervening in their region. This is not a new issue for them, and they are practiced, I would argue, in the art of hedging in international relations terminology. But they're very, very good at certainly since they gained their independence in the wake of the Second World War, they've been very good at fending external powers off. So that's the big challenge for them. It's going to be interesting to see to the degree to which they can do so. I argue in the book it's going to be increasingly difficult for them to do so. And I'll wind up my comments in a minute with some speculations about the future there. So those are kind of preliminary contextual remarks about the study. What are the big takeaways, main findings? Well, 3 or 4 very briefly. First is Southeast Asia's own intrinsic importance. This is no geo-economic or geostrategic backwater. The stakes are very high. This is a very dynamic, physically sprawling region, 3,000 miles from east to west, 2,000 miles from north to south, composed of 11 nation states. Timor-Leste is not yet a member of Asean. It's a candidate to be one, but you have 10 member states of Asean. You have Asean itself, which has been in existence since 1967. It has a combined population of nearly 700 million people, one of the most densely populated regions of the world, and its demographic size is matched by its cultural and religious and ethnic diversity. Probably no region in the world that is as diverse. Everything about Southeast Asia is characterized by diversity. Strategically, it's of vital importance, particularly the South China Sea and the Straits of Malacca, through which pass approximately 50,000 big vessels every year, 40% of the world's merchandise trade, 25% of the world's oil supplies every year pass through these small isthmuses off the western coast of Malaysia and down through Singapore. It's also economically very dynamic region. It's the fastest growing, or has been the fastest growing region in the world since the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Robert just mentioned the fact that ASEAN in the first 2 months of this year has now overtaken the European Union as China's major trading partner. If you put all the 10 economies together, it is now the 6th largest economy in the world with an aggregate GDP of $3 trillion in 2018. And it's a very diverse region politically. You have no fewer than 5 different types of political systems there. So first takeaway point is this is not just about 2 big powers in a third region. Southeast Asia is really significant in and of its own right and should be taken by the United States, I would argue, and I do in the conclusion, on that ground. This is not just a field for competition with Beijing. We have to engage Southeast Asia on Southeast Asia's sake, the same way the United States-India relations, for example, have to be taken on their own stake, irregardless of the China dimension. Second big conclusion I draw is what I call the rivalry between the US and China, I call a soft rivalry rather than a hard rivalry. Now, what do I mean by that? What's the distinction? Well, in the Cold War, I would argue the rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union was an action-reaction, tit-for-tat kind of rivalry. If Moscow did A, Washington did B, Moscow did C to counter Washington, and so on and so forth. It was really very reactive kind of competitions between the superpowers. This competition between Beijing and Washington is not yet reactive in that way. I describe it in the book as sort of like shadow boxing, where they're both these powers are moving around the region, doing their own thing, looking over their shoulder at the other, advancing their own interests and their own positions, but it's not yet into this kind of competitive action-reaction dynamic yet. It might get there, but it's not there yet. So that does distinguish it from the previous Cold War. And it's a more fluid kind of competition. And it has different dimensions to the competition than did the Cold War. An economic dimension for one, but others as well. So that's the second takeaway. Third takeaway is that the US and China are not the only actors in this drama. It's actually, as I said at the outset, a very complex sort of regional chessboard. There are other so-called middle powers, namely Japan, India, Australia, The EU in commercial and cultural terms, not in other ways, but in those two, and even South Korea are all part of the regional mix and part of this chessboard. South Korea, I was actually in the audience in Singapore 2 summers ago when President Moon came down and launched his southward policy. The Russians, they're involved in the region in terms of arms sales, but that's about it. But the point is that this is not just a dyadic competition between the U.S. and China. To be sure, that is the big story. But the big story is ameliorated, you might say, by these other middle powers, plus the ASEAN states themselves, all of whom have significant agency, or not all of them, but some of them do. And then the last conclusion, or actually there are 2 parts of this, and they're kind of counterintuitive. I hadn't really expected this when I got into the project, but by the time I finished, I argue in the book that China is what I call an overestimated power, and that the United States is an underappreciated power. Now, briefly, what do I mean by each? Well, if you travel around the region, it is just, one is struck on a daily basis by this pervasive region-wide narrative that China is already the dominant power in the region. This is the natural state of affairs, that China is rapidly sucking all regional states into its sphere of influence, and that everybody needs to kind of get on the train or on the bandwagon. I argue in the book that even though this narrative is out there and it's dominant, I argue it's empirically inaccurate. I think it's overstated, both if you measure the different components of China's presence in the region, and it's also overstated because I found substantial and pervasive ambivalence and suspicion about China in every single country I visited, including Cambodia, which is as close to a client state as China has in the region. And if you look at public opinion polls, for example, that ICES in Singapore have done, this is borne out. There's deep discomfort, anxiety, ambivalence, and suspicion about China. Secondly, China's, as I say, in what I call an uneven power. It's strong in some areas, primarily economic, cultural, certainly amongst the diaspora, but it's weak in many areas. I would argue in soft power and security assistance, in its own diplomacy, in its united front operations, and its relations with the overseas Chinese diaspora, and the South China Sea. These are all weaknesses, if you will, in China's regional position. BRI, I even argue, is a mixed case. I think it's too early to draw conclusions about BRI, either in Southeast Asia or more broadly. But I see evidence already of China overreaching, overstepping, and alienating constituencies through BRI and through these other actions I just mentioned in the region. And I wonder how long it's going to be before other countries have what I describe as a Myanmar moment or a Malaysia moment. In Myanmar's case back in 2011, the Mitsoni Dam was a kind of catalyst for the Burmese to pull back from their dependence on China and try and open relations with others, including the United States. And then we know that Mahathir, after he won the election against Najib, he renegotiated, he froze 11 BRI projects, renegotiated several of them, still in the process. So both those countries had rethinks because China was too omnipresent, too pervasive, their influence was too pervasive in those two countries. So the point I'm flagging here is how long is it going to be before other ASEAN countries have similar Myanmar moments or Malaysia moments? Now, so that's my takeaway on China, overestimated. Now, the United States I find to be underappreciated. I say that not just as an American, but empirically, if you look at the American footprint across the region. Now, we have our challenges too, believe me. We have lots of them here at home. We have them in the region too. And one of the big challenges in the region, I would argue, is public diplomacy. Southeast Asians don't have a very good sense of what the United States contributes to their region or the activities the Americans are undertaking in their region, either in the education sphere, cultural sphere, commercial sphere, security sphere. And some countries like Malaysia, they don't want it known. Malaysia does a lot with the United States in the military security realm, but no, don't want to talk about it. Same with Indonesia. No, don't want to talk about it. So the U.S. presence is actually underappreciated. The footprint is very deep. Our soft power appeal, our universities are of ongoing attraction to Southeast Asians, and security assistance. Nobody comes near the United States in what we provide for most countries in the region. Even the commercial realm, the American trade is not up there with the Chinese. The Chinese is 587 billion last year. The United States, though, does $350 billion in trade and goods and services with Asean in 2018. And the real untold story is foreign direct investment. So on both an annual and an aggregated basis, American FDI into the region dwarfs China's. This may surprise a lot of viewers, surprise me to come across. It's my favorite statistic. The total stock of US FDI in Southeast Asia is greater than China, Japan, and South Korea combined. It is $329 billion. China is $187 billion. Even on an annual basis, last year, America's FDI into the region is $25.9 billion, China's $12.9 billion. So the US invested twice as much as China. I know this is counterintuitive. It's not what one reads and thinks and hears. There are 4,200 American companies operating in ASEAN. So the commercial footprint of the United States, not insignificant. The security footprint, unrivaled. The soft power cultural footprint, I would argue, unrivaled. Where's America's weaknesses? Diplomacy and reputational, particularly after the last 4 years. Our reputation has taken a real hit in that region, and that's borne out by public opinion polls that are undertaken. But broadly speaking, I would say that the US has a very broad and deep footprint and a very diversified policy toolbox in the region. Even though that's the narrative in the region is all about China, China, China. So my book tries to kind of wrestle with that, distinction. Now, just to conclude, and we can get into our conversation and question and answer period. Looking to the future, I see 4 possible scenarios. First, further bandwagoning with China. Second, continued soft rivalry between these two powers, as I described it, which can lead to competitive coexistence. Third, a harder rivalry, a kind of polarization of the region between the two major powers. And fourthly, a kind of more neutral hedging on the part of ASEAN. So Ray, maybe you could put up that one slide I have to illustrate where I see the region today. Now, this slide is a snapshot of the present, 2020. As I see it, along a spectrum of where these countries fall in general terms of their orientation. And the book describes the metrics for this judgment. Now, you'll see that most of the countries, 7 of 10, are on the Chinese side of the neutral line, okay? 3, Vietnam, Singapore, Philippines, are on the American side of the neutral line. But I would like to note that even those 3 are not out towards the left-hand end of the spectrum. They too have substantial relations with China in all 3 cases. And they're close to being neutral between the 2 major powers. The other 7, I argue, compositely speaking, so-called net assessment, are closer to China. But so that's a kind of snapshot of bandwagoning. That's the situation today. And the narrative that one hears around the region is not incorrect. I just think it's overstated. Then second thing to note about this spectrum is it's fluid and dynamic. 2 years ago, when I was in the region doing research on this book, it was not exactly the way as you see it there. And 2 years from now, or even 6 months from now, there will be further movement. This is viewers and readers need to understand this is a fluid situation, and it can change because of two things, primarily. That leads me to the third conclusion. China's own behavior, I think, is the most important variable going forward. China can continue to what I already see as overreach and overstep and alienate and contribute to this sense of anxiety and suspicion and that I already sense is present in a number of countries, or China can recalibrate and listen and understand what produces these anxieties. Now, I have to say that there's not a whole lot of evidence to me, as a student of Chinese foreign policy, this is not a country that listens very well and takes constructively criticisms from others and recalibrates its diplomacy based on criticisms. No, that's not Beijing's norm. So China's on a kind of autopilot in the region, and I argue in the book that if it continues in this autopilot, it's going to produce what I call the iron law of international relations, counterbalancing, pushback. You're already seeing it in several countries. So that can lead to the fourth of those four scenarios, what I call more neutral hedging. In other words, all these Southeast Asian countries will move towards the neutral line, not towards the United States. Those days, bandwagoning with Washington, they're over. But they can move away from Beijing and try and position themselves more in the center of the spectrum. And that is the sort of sweet spot for all Southeast Asian countries. They really eschew overdependency. They have been through long imperial and colonial experiences. They don't want to get too close to any external power. So those are the four scenarios. There may be some greater pressures for polarization between the two powers, the U.S. and China. That depends on how they play their hands. Just to conclude then, how should the United States play its hand? First of all, I think one of America's great assets in this competition is China itself, because China is overplaying its hand, in my view, and is very capable of doing so, not just in Southeast Asia. I see this across the planet, and the recent Pew polls give some credence to that statement. So the one thing the Americans can do, the most important thing, is just be there, be present, stay steady, invest in all the tools of power, diplomacy, military, commerce, cultural, public diplomacy, and so on, and give the region an option to China. When Beijing becomes too omnipresent, too overbearing, too proximate, too manipulative, and too interventionist, Washington can offer an alternative. So my advice to the new Biden administration, get in the game, be present, keep your cool, and resource your presence. So why don't I stop there and look forward to Ambassador Roy's comments.
Well, thank you, David. Before we go to Ambassador Roy, a reminder to all of our listeners, we would love to hear from you. Your questions are most welcome. If you have a question, please start sending them now to china@wilsoncenter, it's one word, .org. Again, china@wilsoncenter.org with your questions. Thank you. Ambassador Roy.
David, thank you for those opening remarks and your very good summary of your very important book. I hope that a lot of people read your book, because I have found that far too many Americans do not have an instinctive understanding of the importance of Southeast Asia. During the Vietnam War period, we did have a lot of focus in our academic institutions on Southeast Asia, but with the end of the Vietnam War, that just fell off the agenda. And it's only in recent years that Southeast Asian institutes have been re-emerging in our academic institutions. To illustrate this problem, when I was the Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Research in the State Department, I remember being asked by a very senior State Department official, why was it necessary for the Secretary of State to attend ASEAN meetings? And I was taken aback, because in the State Department of all places, it seemed to me it was not necessary to ask that sort of question. And yet that reflected the inability to sort of instinctively grasp the importance of the region. We shouldn't be talking about Southeast Asia without a world map on the screen, because what you realize every day when we pick up the newspapers, we read stories about how China has ambitions to dominate the world. But when you look at the map, what you discover is that China, in a naval sense, is bottled up in East Asia. You can't get from the South China Sea and the Pacific to the Indian Ocean and the West, except by going through very narrow straits that in a wartime situation would be impassable or could easily be made impassable. We attached enormous strategic importance to the Panama Canal in terms of our security, but China, in looking at its global ambitions, is in a situation where it cannot be assured of access to the areas west of China in a naval sense, except by passage through Southeast Asia. But it doesn't control the straits in Southeast Asia, and it doesn't control the first island chain that runs from Japan down through Taiwan to the Philippines. That means that China has to depend on diplomacy in order to assure itself of the access to the rest of the world that it needs in order to play a great power role. And therefore, China is going to give very high priority to its diplomacy in Southeast Asia. And that's something the Americans have to take into account in our own competition with China for global influence. And that's not something we instinctively understand. And I think that reading your book provides a much better sense of why this is important. There's another point I'd like to make, which is that we actually have an advantage, because much of your description of China's behavior in dealing with Southeast Asia is characteristic of the United States' behavior in dealing with smaller countries. We both have an inclination to be arrogant, to be preachy. We had the Monroe Doctrine because Spain and Portugal and Britain and France and the Netherlands had historic interests in the Western Hemisphere when we became an independent country, and we didn't like that. We resented their presence, and in a way, the Monroe Doctrine was a way of saying, when the colonial empires weakened, that we don't want you back, get out of the region. Well, guess what? China has very much a similar attitude. Countries like us, for 2 centuries, have had important interests in East Asia and Southeast Asia, and the Chinese recognize that, but they don't like it. They would be happy to see us have a weakened presence in the region. The second thing that is similar is China really doesn't like the association of Southeast Asian nations, because it and the European Union are about the only 2 organizations in the world that were formed independently by the members, not under the aegis of an external power, in order to collectively express their interests. And China doesn't like that. It prefers to deal bilaterally with the countries of Southeast Asia, because then the power differential between the great central kingdom and the individual states of Southeast Asia, with the exception of Indonesia, which is a much larger entity, is important to them. But the solidarity of the Asean countries has been sufficient to force China to have to deal with them collectively on some issues. But we should understand that. The second point I would make, you emphasized how important it is for the Southeast Asians to have the Americans present. But this is not just in a military sense. They want us present economically. And here we should be able to understand this by looking to our south, because the Central American countries, who used to be banana republics, did not like being dominated by the American economy, did not like being under the thumb of the United Fruit Company. And the Southeast Asians all have more trade with China now than they have with the United States, but they're afraid of becoming too dependent on China through trade and through Chinese investment in their region. And they desperately want the United States to be giving more attention to our deep embedment in the expanding economies of the Southeast Asian countries as a way of avoiding overdomination by China. But our problem is we have a tendency to look at this more from the standpoint of the big power. And instead, we ought to reverse the psychology a bit and understand that some of the factors that have plagued our policy in the Western Hemisphere in dealing with our southern neighbors have reflections in Southeast Asia. Now, here there are enormous differences, because in Northeast Asia, China is surrounded by great big powers. Unlike us, we have Canada to our north, and it's big, but it's not one of the world's great powers. But China has Japan, it has Russia, it has India on its borders. It has 4 nuclear weapon countries on its borders: North Korea and Russia and Pakistan and India. So that China not only has big powers there, but it has these problems to its south that it has to deal with. And as you, I think, very well expressed, it has a tendency to show its big power chauvinism when it would be much better advised to not show it in the way that it deals with these countries. That said, let's pick up on your final point. You gave us 4 options: further bandwagoning with China, continued soft rivalry and competitive coexistence, hard rivalry and polarization of the region, or more neutral hedging. I would argue that those aren't distinct choices. That probably in looking at Southeast Asia, we are going to see elements of all of those. And I'd be interested in your comments. Which do you see is most important and most dominant? And here, of course, I would argue that Indonesia has to be looked at as perhaps the most important country. And here, there's something I'd be interested in your reflection on it. Indonesia and Thailand are the 2 countries in which military involvement in the political process has been a major factor in their political development. And in dealing with these countries, when you talk to the military, you often get a very different attitude in terms of their willingness to be aligned as compared to their political leadership. And that means you can make serious policy misjudgments by thinking, because the militaries want you to be closer to them, that you can establish a closer relationship with the country by ignoring the political attitudes, which may not be supportive of that. Did you encounter this in your time in Southeast Asia?
Okay, let me unmute myself. Thank you, State, very much for your last question, but also your experienced observations on the region. As I start off by saying, I don't know of anybody who's as deeply knowledgeable about both China and Southeast Asian countries as you. But just to pick up and respond and get our open the conversation up more broadly. To your last point, you're absolutely right about the militaries and the civilians. That's one point. One finds that also at the present time in the last couple of years in the Philippines.
Philippines, yes.
So here you have a case where Duterte comes to power, tries to swing the Philippines towards China for the first time ever in history, but it's a swing being produced by a single actor I found in my visits to and research in the Philippines. He did this on his own. There was very little push from inside the Philippines, certainly not in the armed forces, or really in the commercial community. Well, a bit more in the commercial community because the Philippines has such dire infrastructural needs. But you know the Philippines very well. It's had a long history, not a very pleasant one, has to be said, of colonization by the United States. But its orientation vis-a-vis between the U.S. and China has always been far more towards the U.S. and the Filipino-American community, very active in this country and so on. But the Philippines, armed forces of the Philippines are not at all attracted to China strategically. And they don't buying some light weapons and so on. But my prediction is the minute Duterte leaves office, the Philippines is going to swing. And actually the pivot to Beijing that he has engineered has not produced many dividends, shall we say, and it's being criticized dramatically within the Philippines. But your question is really about Indonesia and Thailand, which are really the key actors in the region. Vietnam's a very significant actor too, as is Malaysia. In my own view, Thailand is the swing state in this competition between the US and China. Thailand has a so-called alliance with the United States, but if you don't even have to dig down very far to find it's not an alliance in the sense that we Americans think of alliances. It's based on the Rusk-Tanat communique of 1964 and a couple of other statements, but it's not an alliance as we think of them in terms of mutual defense. For example, one anecdote I came across in the research and have in the book is that in the wake of 9/11, the 9/11 attacks, the then Thai Prime Minister Thaksin asked his National Security Council to take the alliance out of the drawer and read it. Does it have an Article 5 clause? Does this mean we, Thailand, have to come to the assistance of the United States? He was very nervous that that was the case. And so they took out the document and found there was no automatic Article 5 clause of helping the United States. And that was a great relief to him and to the Thais. But that's the way the Thais, I have a long section in the book, and Catherine Dalpino here in Washington, is really the world's expert on this. This is not really an alliance, first of all, but the Thais, more than any Southeast Asian country, have swung towards China across multiple sectors. 40% of the Thai population traces its ethnicity to China, to Chinese. This is not just a diaspora situation in Thailand. The military, here's a classic example. They have a coup, they have frequent coups. They've had 18 coups since 1960, I think. The last one was in 2014. That triggered automatic congressional mandated actions that the United States cut off a large amount, but not all of our military interactions with and support for the Thai military. Cobra Gold did continue, but on a far reduced level. But it really alienated the Thai military and pushed them even closer to China. I'm told during this research, and now 40% of the Thai officer corps have now received some kind of training in China. They have a joint munitions factory that the PLA has established in Thailand to assemble armored personnel carriers and tanks. This is the first one outside of China, anywhere in the world. They have a large number of exercises. Thailand has more air and naval exercises than any other Southeast Asian country with the People's Liberation Army. They have some intelligence sharing. So the Thai security relationship with the Chinese is maybe, I'm not going to say it's as close as it is with the United States today, but it's getting there. So Thailand, I see, is really the key swing state in this U.S. China competition. Indonesia, as you well know, is the most insular country I have ever visited. It is just so self-consumed with itself and things going on in its very large society that it doesn't even think of ASEAN. Indonesia is the natural leader of ASEAN given its size and its geographic location, but it leads from behind at best. Indonesians have no sense of the strategic clouds circulating around them and this U.S. China competition and other other elements. They're just totally internally preoccupied. The Indonesian Armed Forces, the TNI, similar story. The United States cut them off for human rights abuses in East Timor. Again, mandated by congressional legislation, we had to do it, but it really alienated a whole generation of Indonesian officers who are now retiring. And there's a new generation getting to the top of the ranks. And the U.S. military assistance program to Indonesia is now very broad and very deep. I go into it in the book. So I don't want to belabor this question, but you really put your finger on one of the key issues. It's these two countries, Thailand, Indonesia, and the role of the military in each. And if the United States, I'm not going to say that we shouldn't, our congressional legislation is what it is. And, it's passed for reasons, and it has to be enforced when there's a coup. But it hasn't served our strategic interests well in those two cases. But thank you, Stape, for starting the conversation with that question. We can go on to Vietnam is another really interesting case, but let's open it up. Robert, you want to?
Yes, again, if you have a question, please send it into china@wilsoncenter.org. And we do have some questions. Ray, if I could ask you to read the first.
Certainly. So this one comes from Stephen Jackson. The question is, of the countries in Asean, which ones would be most robust as a long-term partner for the United States foreign policy of the 21st century?
Well, great question from my former classmate, University of Michigan PhD classmate, Stephen Jackson. Good to see you out there, Steve, another Michael Oxenberg, Alan Whiting student. So that's a great question. I think, in order to answer it, we have to kind of refer back to that spectrum. I don't want you to put it back up, Ray, but, the country that is probably most closely oriented to the U.S. is still the Philippines. I think Duterte is an outlier, and that, as I say, as soon as he leaves the scenes, you're going to see a re-gravitation or re-strengthening of U.S.-Filipino relations. Singapore, very strong relations between the U.S. and Singapore in all dimensions. Particularly military. There's no country in Southeast Asia who has stronger military strategic ties with the US than does Singapore, and we don't have an alliance with them. I opened the book, by the way, with a visit on board the USS Carl Vinson at the Changi Naval Base, which is just one kind of illustrative dimension of that US-Singaporean defense relationship. But there's a general, I would say, orientation in Singapore towards the U.S. But on the other hand, Singapore, has deep commercial ties and obviously ethnic ties as well to China. What it doesn't have is a diaspora problem. Now, if you go through all of these Southeast Asian countries, you will find ethnic Chinese diaspora, and that has been a very sore point, a very sensitive element to China's relations with every one of these countries going back decades. And it hasn't been pretty, particularly in Indonesia. Not just in 1965 following the coup, when nearly 2 million ethnic Chinese were slaughtered within 6 weeks, but more recently, even 4 years ago, in Jakarta, I was taken through a neighborhood that was firebombed and burned out 4 years ago in anti-Chinese riots, and they still have not demolished and rebuilt those buildings. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit away from Steve's question. There's no natural, that's really a good question, Steve. There's no natural, strong American ally amongst these 10 countries. And I argue in the book, including Vietnam. Vietnam may be at one end of my spectrum, but the Vietnamese are slow walking the relationship with the United States, particularly in the defense realm. If you talk to the to the Pentagon and to the US defense attachés in Hanoi, they will quickly tell you that the Vietnamese are the ones who are putting the brakes on the defense relationship with the US. They allow one ship visit per year. There's all kinds of things the Americans do with Thailand, with the Philippines, with Indonesia, with Malaysia, that the Vietnamese will not permit in the defense sphere. And Vietnam has, the other thing that's not really known very well is the depth of the Vietnamese-China relationship, party to party level, obviously commercial level, even military to military exchanges. Yes, they really have enormous difficulties over their disputed islands in the Paracels in the South, in the Paracels in the South China Sea. They have, millennia of animosity towards each other. There's a lot of problems in that relationship, but I was surprised to find the depth of China-Vietnamese relations when I visited there, and I think it's a mistake in Washington here inside the Beltway to think that somehow Vietnam is America's natural ally in the U.S. China competition in Southeast Asia. I think that's overstated. I think the Vietnamese, like every other Southeast Asian country, is trying to navigate in between these two, maximize what they can get from both. And in the case of Vietnam, they're actually much closer to China than we Americans recognize. So there's some wishful thinking, I think, here in Washington about the nature of the relationship with Vietnam. A good question, Steve. Thank you.
Okay, next question comes from Philip Lacour. The question is, how come Vietnam, which has the second largest communist party in the world after the CCP, appears to be America's closest ally in Southeast Asia? Shouldn't we take into account the party-to-party ties between the CCP and Communist Party of Vietnam to get a full picture of these results? Do you really believe the US is winning the game with the Vietnamese public?
Well, Philippe, good to hear and see you too. But I think I anticipated your question with the last response, actually. So the way you phrased your question is exactly the way what I've come to understand about the Vietnamese-China relationship, and I think there's a lot of wishful thinking going on in Washington about the relationship with Vietnam. But I don't want to overstate that either. I have had several visits to Vietnam, to Hanoi, and I've talked to their military, I've talked to their party people, I've talked to their foreign ministry, I've talked to students. It's complicated, complicated by centuries of geography, if nothing else. If Vietnam were not contiguous to China, it would be a different story, but it is contiguous to China, and the Chinese occupied Vietnam for a century, and the book is filled with other examples of invasions that succeeded, partially succeeded and then failed. I mean, so this is a relationship that has a lot of baggage. But again, I don't think American policymakers should overestimate either the US Vietnam leg of that or underestimate the China Vietnam leg of that. So I think, Philippe, you and I are kind of on the same page there. Thanks for your question.
Okay, next question comes from Walter North. The question is, any ideas about how to help China improve its diplomatic listening skills?
Great question. I just finished teaching my Chinese foreign policy class, and in our last session, we talked about the future of Chinese foreign policy. What are the greatest challenges? And that was my conclusion, is China has to improve its listening skills. You cannot be a major power and not get criticized. It comes with being a major power. The question is, what do you do with the criticism? Do you take it, reflect on it, engage the criticizer, and maybe reflect on it and then recalibrate your policy? Or do you have a tin ear and not listen? I argue, and I think it's China's greatest impediment, they live in a propaganda bubble and echo chamber, and they have a strong sense of exceptionalism, and they are on autopilot, and they just don't have much peripheral vision, both visually or audibly. They don't listen. And it's obviously a authoritarian political system where there's a message sent down. Everybody below has to biao tai and ting hua, and get on message. So it goes back to the domestic Chinese political system, I would say, the inability to listen and to take criticism constructively. Now, if China listened better and took criticism constructively and recalibrated some of its behavior, it would get a whole lot farther. But I don't see any evidence, none, of China doing that. And that's going to be its greatest weakness. That's going to be one of the real Achilles heels to China as a major power in the world. So unless they can, and that's why they don't have soft power, right? One of the reasons they don't have soft power. There are other reasons too, but that's a different subject. But if you're going to be a major power in the world, sorry, criticism comes with the territory. You better get used to it. And the question is, how do you deal with it? How do you handle it? And there, I don't see, much that's very encouraging out of Beijing so far. Quite to the contrary, there have been periods in the past, and I think Stape can speak to this too, in which they were more. They did listen better. They would engage arguments better, but not this current regime. I don't see much evidence of that.
Stape, could we get you to weigh in? Is there any way to make China more Oprah-like in its diplomacy, especially as regards Southeast Asia?
When I was the assistant secretary for intelligence and research, I was in charge of our polling overseas. And we found consistently that overseas countries, both in Europe and in South Asia, elsewhere, they liked America and they deeply resented the way that Americans dealt with them because we were arrogant, demanding, and wouldn't listen. I would feed these reports up to our senior officials, and it was like water off a duck's back. They paid absolutely no attention. So I was smiling to myself when I heard David discussing how China is behaving in exactly the same way. I think China needs a school of how to listen to other people, but I think that we should not be the teachers, we should be the students along with them.
Thanks. Ray, next question, please.
Okay. So this one is from Don Lewis. Don asks, will RCEP, CPTPP, and the ASEAN Economic Community, all expressions of strengthening regional integration and ASEAN centrality, help ASEAN retain its independence and enhance its economic power vis-a-vis China? What should the U.S. do to further support such developments? Should the Biden administration join CPTPP and indeed set in motion integration towards FTAP?
Awful lot of acronyms in there, Ray. You did very well. Better than I can trying to repeat them. And there's a lot packed into that question, and I'm not sure how to really unpack it. I mean, first of all, I think TPP was a significant, very significant, hard-earned, hard-worked accomplishment of the Obama administration. I was in Singapore beginning research for this book the day that Trump announced the withdrawal from it. And you could just physically, almost audibly hear the air sucked out of the region, after they had spent 8 years, not all the ASEAN countries, but several of them, coming on board to TPP. It was another example of how the United States is viewed, which I haven't really had a chance to talk about. And, the US is viewed as kind of episodically interested, particularly our diplomacy. It's what I call parachute diplomacy. Fly in, give a reassuring speech, fly out, and don't be seen for another 6 months. That has been the pattern over multiple administrations, with the exception of the Obama administration. So Trump reverted to the norm, and we'll see if the Biden administration can pay more sustained attention diplomatically and otherwise, but including commercially. And that's where your question fits. So I would hope, first of all, that we rejoin CPTPP, even in a reconfigured, there's some discussions going on now about trying to reconfigure it for labor standards and other elements, kind of updating it and then rejoining it. I think that would be the first step. Second step, I would argue, is a regional FTA with the entirety of ASEAN, just as China put in place in 2010. We're now a decade on since China and the ASEAN 10 initiated their own multilateral FTA. It's the only multilateral FTA China has in the world. We don't have multilateral FTAs. We don't even particularly like bilateral FTAs. The only FTA we have in the region, I believe, is with Vietnam and Singapore. But anyway, I think we should give some thought to an ASEAN-wide FTA. RCEP is new. It's a kind of multilateral FTA of all of its members, from what I can understand. It's not a high caliber, it's not a TPP type of institution, wasn't really intended to be one. But the US should certainly look to joining that as well. Long story short, the more the United States is in these organizations, existing ones, the better, including AIIB, I would note. So the US has got to get literally to the table and be part of the solution to regional integration, economic integration, and not outside, these groupings. So good question. Thank you.
Okay, next question is from Alexandra Hackbarth. The question is, there are certainly areas where the US must compete with China. However, the US must also find ways to cooperate on some complex issues such as climate change. Yet the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Paris Accords created a climate leadership vacuum that China is trying to fill. Furthermore, the lack of US leadership on climate the last 4 years has limited the ability to exert influence in many ways. How should the Biden administration re-engage China on climate change, given the US seems to be in a weaker position vis-a-vis China right now?
Well, thank you, Alexandra, but the question's a bit off topic from Southeast Asia. I mean, I agree with you that the US needs to re-engage with China and with COP21, rejoin COP21, which President-elect Biden is going to do on day one, he tells us. That's good news. There are a number of areas of global governance, that we call it, in which the US and China have overlapping and considerable shared national interest. Climate is probably at the top of that list, and one can go through several other areas. So I am in favor of cooperation with China on a variety of global and regional issues, including in Southeast Asia. That includes counter-piracy operations, container security operations, joint programs with other countries in ASEAN about to counter human trafficking and other so-called non-traditional security challenges, and regional environmental challenges, and that includes on the Mekong. So yes, the U.S.-China competition is not devoid of cooperation. There are obvious areas of overlap where we should be not only talking to, but working with China. ODA, aid, assistance, overseas development assistance, is another one of those areas. We have complementary approaches, I would argue, not contradictory approaches when it comes to ODA, including in mainland Southeast Asia and even in Indonesia. And we can work together through the Asian Development Bank, through the AIIB. So there are a number of opportunities there. I mean, your question, even though it was about climate, broadly speaking, I think it does raise, the reality of that the U.S.-China competition has a cooperative dimension to it in the region in Southeast Asia. And there's no reason the U.S. and China shouldn't be working together with the other countries of the region. Again, not dyadically, but embedded within ASEAN.
Okay. Next question is from John Hicklin. Question is, in avoiding potential future conflict, Graham Allison argues the U.S. may need to focus on its long-term strategic self-interest and not challenge China unnecessarily. Do you agree? What would this imply for the U.S. role in ASEAN?
Well, I'm not of the view that the United States should not challenge, I'm not sure I follow the question entirely, challenge China unnecessarily. I'm of the view the United States should push back against China in many domains and many regions, and that includes in Southeast Asia. And I argue in the book that the US has a very strong foundation from which to push back and to pursue our own interests. It's not all about competition, it's about pursuing American interests in the region. So, I'm not an accommodationist. I'm not one who thinks that we have to find some kind of accommodation with China and return to some nirvana of engagement of the past. There are those who think that. There are others who don't. I have gravitated in my own thinking away from that. So I'm a bit more sober-minded about that. So I'm a little bit more, I guess, on the Graham Allison paradigm in that regard.
Okay, I have, I think, one last question in the queue, and it is from Catherine Salai, who asks, do ASEAN countries view the US reputation as repairable, or do you think the last 4 years will leave a lasting skepticism of American politics?
Well, there's a great deal of anxiety in Southeast Asia about the United States too. All the adjectives I used to describe Southeast Asian views of China, one can almost equally apply to the United States, and then exponentially so over the last 4 years. Just take a look at the annual survey that the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore does. Comes out every January. We're due for one soon, but last January just revealed the absolute deterioration, plummeting of the American reputation across the region during the last 4 years. And there's a lot of genuine concern, not just about Trump's policies and the Islamophobia, for example, but about the dysfunctionality of American democracy, the systemic racism that has been apparent even before this past summer, the inequality in the United States, the arrogance, the me first, there's a lot of issues that make Southeast Asians wring their hands about America too, right after they finish wringing their hands about Beijing. So it's very similar kind of anxieties, but I guess the point is that Southeast Asians expect and would hope for more from the US. And there's a reservoir of respect there and cultural ties that goes way back in time that I argue in the book I did not find with regard to China. So yes, the US has a lot of repair work to do, a lot of healing to do across the Atlantic with our European allies. We have it to do in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. But I think you'll find, and even Kishore Mahbubani in his most recent book argues that there is a deep reservoir of goodwill and respect for the United States and Southeast Asia. And Mahbubani, as you know, is quite critical of the US, but that's one of his interesting conclusions in he's written a book recently about U.S. China competition as well. So I think it's a really good question to end on. Americans have to appreciate how they are viewed abroad, and it is not a pretty picture, and it's not static. And just because you may have a positive view of the United States, say at the end of the Obama administration, I argue in the book that Southeast Asian US relations were never better in history in 250 years than they were during the Obama administration. It has to do with Obama himself, has to do with the policies. So he left a very positive residual effect. But here we are 4 years later, and that respect has deteriorated, but it can be rebuilt. And with the right, by listening, by showing up, by being respectful and getting our own house in order, I think that we can rebuild the basis of US Southeast Asian relations that I found in my research.
Once again, David, thank you so much for launching another one of your books with us here at the Wilson Center. We hope that your subsequent books will bring you back and that we'll see you in other discussions as well. Thanks, David. Thanks, Ambassador Roy, and also Ray Jung for all of your help, and Tracy and Trian, who've been with us in the tech suite. Again, the book, Where Great Powers Meet, suitable from readers about 3 to 93, I would say, so you can go out and get it. I wish all of you a very happy and healthy holiday, and we look forward to seeing you at the Wilson Center again in the new year. So thank you all.